A fossil mislabeled for decades as a baby lamprey recently forced a rethink of how vertebrates first crawled out of the water. This discovery, found in a veterans collection and reported in Smithsonian Magazine this week, shows how easily the record is misread. There's another kind of record-keeping happening in the wild, though. Writing for Noema earlier this month, Ryan Huling argues that animal traditions, like the dialects of whale songs, should be recognized as intangible cultural heritage. It's worth pausing on how these two stories meet. The rigid boundary between human history and animal evolution feels increasingly thin, whether the evidence sits in a drawer of old bones or the learned behaviors of a living pod. When bighorn sheep were moved to the Rockies, many simply stopped migrating because they hadn't been taught the route. Writing for Noema earlier this month, Ryan Huling argues that animal traditions deserve the same UNESCO protections granted to human theater or yodeling. Notice how he places the dialect of a sperm whale alongside the architectural traditions of a sparrow weaver, treating nature as a collection of specific, learned histories.
Ryan Huling is a writer and explorer focusing on animals, food, and technology. He is a senior writer at the Good Food Institute Asia Pacific Inc. and the author of The Hidden Nations of Animals. When ecologists relocated dozens of bighorn sheep from Oregon, eastern Wyoming, and other locations to the Rocky Mountains to restore populations eradicated by hunters, the animals, typically seasonal migrants, had no idea what to do. A handful decided to follow local bighorns around to learn how they navigated this vast and unfamiliar terrain. The rest didn't even attempt to migrate. The local herds traveled along time-tested pathways they had learned from their ancestors, reliable routes that had been shrewdly forged between high-risk predation areas and short plant growth seasons. This centuries-old migratory practice, researchers determined, is driven not by instinct, but shared through cultural transmissions from parent to child or peer to peer. If a herd's traditional pathways are disrupted, such as by human interference, it expunges generations of knowledge. Similar community-based behaviors exist in many non-human societies. Sperm whales communicate using group-specific dialects older than Sanskrit. Certain chimpanzee communities share knowledge of how to use stone tools to crack open palm oil nuts. Matriarchal forest elephants pass down wisdom about extensive pathway networks through the Congo Basin undergrowth, where new generations learn about established transit corridors by following their elders. White-browed sparrow weavers build nests according to the distinctive style of their cultural group, each of which has its own architectural traditions. And yet, such behaviors, which are often crucial to animal survival, are not acknowledged by global institutions dedicated to protecting cultural activities. They are conspicuously absent from the list of roughly 800 intangible cultural heritage practices and expressions recognized by the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO. Inclusion on that list could open the door to special protections and funding for preservation.
To be eligible for UNESCO nomination, cultural activities must be actively practiced today and fit within one of 5 key domains: oral traditions and expressions, traditional craftsmanship, performing arts, knowledge and practices on nature and the universe, or social practices, rituals, and festive events. The list runs the gamut from submissions of near-universal renown, kabuki theater, reggae music, to the borderline self-parodic, such as Bosnian grass-mowing competitions. Also on the list, distinct Turkish whistling languages and alpine yodeling dialects used to unite isolated agrarian communities across vast mountain valleys. Some intangible practices on the list involve millions of participants, such as the sacred Kumbh Mela festival, where oral traditions and knowledge are shared every few years in cities along the Ganges River. Others, like Iran's fabled Bakshi music traditions, have only a handful of remaining practitioners. The limiting factor for inclusion isn't scale, it's species. This is, regrettably, reflective of humanity's enduring sense of superiority. But by failing to recognize animal culture, we risk destabilizing or losing the sophisticated non-human societies that created the world we think of as our own. Generations of knowledge.
To the extent that animals are represented on the UNESCO list, it is exclusively in the service of human enrichment. Mystical animal sacrifices got a green light. So did Slovenian beekeeping, Middle Eastern falconry, and Omani camel racing. In 2020, bullfighting was very nearly added to the list at Spain's request, until People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, PETA, and other animal advocates successfully campaigned against it. But seasonal droving of sheep is venerated, as are specialized techniques of reindeer herding. What's missing from the list is any recognition that if those sheep and reindeer were not relegated to subservient roles, they would likely be engaging in ancient cultural exchanges of their own, as their species have since long before Homo sapiens emerged. Biologists have shown, for instance, that if reindeer, also known as caribou, discover that their traditional feeding area has been rendered inaccessible by freezing rain, they will draw on a pool of shared memories to identify alternative spots where they have succeeded in overcoming such challenges in the past.
In some cases, non-human communities even demonstrate cultural practices that have clear parallels to our own, which shouldn't be surprising, given that some anthropologists argue early humans were inspired to engage in everything from cave painting to infrastructural engineering by observing what bears, beavers, and other animals were up to. Rain-making songs and dances practiced by humans in Japan and Botswana have been selected for UNESCO protection. The latter has been flagged as in need of urgent safeguarding. But as the late Jane Goodall and her colleagues documented, chimpanzee populations in Gombe, Mahale, and other sub-Saharan regions also perform dramatic rain dances, which can involve charging, calling, slapping, and dragging branches, part of a broader pattern of culturally variable display behaviors across chimp communities. Similarly, entire books have been dedicated to the methods through which some animals grieve the loss of companions and mates in socially influenced, and sometimes group-specific, behaviors that echo the rituals human societies use to venerate their dead. Asian elephants in India's Bengal region, for instance, have been documented loudly mourning and burying their dead calves in a manner reminiscent of human funeral rites. But such practices have too often been dismissed as fundamentally different in kind from human culture. As the thinking goes, humans make and do things because only we have culture, and when those things we make and do change over time, we call it history, writes zooarchaeologist Sarah Newman of the University of Chicago. When animals make and do things, we call it instinct, not culture. When the things they make and do change over time, we call it evolution, not history. As technology deepens humanity's knowledge of other animal societies, a growing scientific cohort finds that distinction increasingly untenable. In a peer-reviewed treatise for Nature Sustainability last October, biologists, philosophers, and evolutionary anthropologists from the University of Bristol, the University of Zurich, and the London School of Economics and Political Science asserted that animal cultures have intrinsic, irreplaceable value, and yet they are not adequately protected by preserving habitat. The time has come for UNESCO to explicitly protect non-human cultural heritage alongside human heritage. They rooted their argument in three main points. First, they made the case that animals have demonstrated distinct cultures. By any conventional definition, animals possess socially learned behaviors, norms, traditions, and knowledge that may be passed down through generations and are distinct from those of other groups. Second, they argued that animal cultures help other species survive, benefiting biodiversity, and provide value for humans by expanding our understanding of the complexity and sophistication of the social lives of animals. Third, they asserted that existing UNESCO protections for habitat areas, such as nature preserves, are woefully insufficient because when societies move, their cultures travel with them. To rectify this omission, the authors propose an elegant solution. Add a new item to UNESCO's submissions criteria to allow for an outstanding example of animal culture, demonstrating behavioral patterns and social learning that are integral in the traditions and ecosystems of an animal species, population, or group. Their amendment seeks not to expand the fundamental definition of culture, as humans currently understand it, but to fulfill it as written. Yet this strikes at the heart of humanity's long-held conception of its own intellectual supremacy. It decenters Homo sapiens as the genesis of all culture on Earth in a way that has historically ruffled feathers, even as many leading thinkers now agree that such a correction is long overdue.
the Atlas of Animal Kind. 100 years ago, naturalist Henry Beston leased a small plot of sand on Cape Cod and built a tiny cottage where he could focus on his writing. But as Beston quickly realized, the beach surrounding his fortress of solitude was anything but vacant. In fact, it was densely inhabited by seabirds, foxes, deer, and other individuals, whose daily routines he found to be more orderly and sensible than those of his fellow humans. Writing in his seminal work, The Outermost House, Beston presciently intuited that, far from being background players in Earth's vast cultural landscape, other animals are gifted with extensions of the senses we have lost or never attained, living by voices we shall never hear. They are neither brethren nor underlings, he wrote. They are other nations. Today, Beston's expansive view of animal kind is more visible to us than ever before.
As I document in my nonfiction travelogue, The Hidden Nations of Animals, high-resolution satellite imagery, machine learning systems, and advanced GPS technologies are rapidly decoding ancient animal societies with unprecedented detail, illuminating a world brimming with cultural abundance. In northwest India, for instance, animal behavior expert Hemal Naik and his colleagues from Project Mela, an acronym inspired by the Sanskrit word mela, meaning a gathering where culture, tradition, and connection converge, have spent years documenting the lives of native antelopes known as blackbucks. Renowned for their long, spiraled horns, blackbucks have inspired Indian folklore, paintings, and literature for at least 2,000 years. Some populations also engage in elaborate courtship displays as part of a rare mating system called lekking, a practice observed primarily among birds. In a scene strikingly reminiscent of the UNESCO-endorsed festivals held by disparate nomadic peoples for courtship, weddings, dancing, and old-school social networking, hundreds of male blackbucks gather in clustered territories, raise their chins skyward, and employ fancy footwork to impress female onlookers. Naik theorizes that such practices may be essential to the long-term survival of these populations, because the gathering of males from across a vast region enables females to efficiently evaluate the fitness of many potential suitors. If their time-honored practice were somehow disrupted, the antelopes could have far fewer mating choices, potentially triggering a downward spiral. The blackbuck's traditional gatherings unfold over a handful of weeks each year within highly specific areas known as lekking arenas. Within these arenas, males form large circular territories with distinct scent markings, then carve shallow depressions in the soil with their horns where females can rest, an ecosystem engineering tableau visible in satellite imagery. By unobtrusively flying a fleet of drones at altitudes beyond the animal's perception, the Project Mela team filmed more than 150 hours of footage, the single largest collection of drone recordings ever compiled of a non-human behavior. This footage was then analyzed using a custom-built AI system capable of tracking individual interactions with unprecedented precision, revealing which males prevailed in head-to-head competitions and which courtship strategies proved most successful.
With more than 1 million annotations, their dataset effectively deciphers the precise practices that sustain this ancient ritual and lays the groundwork for its preservation. We now understand that humans are not the creators of all, or perhaps even most cultures that keep our world in balance, Naik told me. To see the full picture, we have to zoom our lens much farther out. The least we could do. Despite the growing body of evidence that animal cultures have played an important role in inspiring the human heritages we cherish today, UNESCO is not currently considering adding any new criteria to the World Heritage Convention. Francois Wibeau, a press officer with the organization, cautioned that such a step would be a significant and lengthy process, requiring review through the convention's statutory procedures. In December 2025, the World Heritage Team at the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, launched a 5-year initiative to explore how knowledge of animal cultures can support biodiversity conservation, Wibeau noted. But the IUCN is not part of the UN, and its work is already explicitly focused on wildlife conservation, so this initiative does not represent a significant widening of humanity's lens. For behavioral ecologist Denai Papageorgiou, who co-authored the Nature Sustainability piece calling for a UNESCO animal culture amendment,
The scientific basis for her argument gets stronger by the day as we gradually discover what the rest of the animal kingdom is up to. Fossil evidence suggests that specific chimpanzee populations have been using stone tools for more than 4,300 years, but documentation of this practice was not published until the 1960s. Better late than never. While we can disagree about the outer frontiers of cultural knowledge, modern science has long since moved past the Cartesian dichotomy that once divided rational human minds from the alleged automatons of the animal kingdom. Now, Papageorgiou says, it's time for other global institutions to get with the program. Conservationists who measure the ebb and flow of top-line animal population numbers can now judge their success by an additional metric, the preservation of animal kind's cultural vibrancy.
To facilitate this, research teams have begun developing frameworks to help organizations recognize cultural traditions as a measurable unit to conserve. Such systems take often murky processes of social learning and cultural transmission and seek to concretize them as trackable items to which resources can be committed. Given that even a brief disruption in an ancestral animal migration route can inadvertently contribute to a complete collapse in spatial knowledge, a loss that science writer Ben Goldfarb has called as thorough as the erasure of a language, multilateral institutions are arguably already failing in their stated mission to preserve vulnerable cultural practices if they refuse to broaden their scope. If humanity's greatest institutions are serious about stemming irreversible cultural loss on our planet, Papageorgiou's proposed UNESCO amendment should be a moral baseline to build on. Plainly, if the shared traditions of other animals fit within our existing vision of what cultural practices look like, recognizing that reality really is the least we could do. In broadening our horizons in this way, we must be careful not to expect other animals to fit within the narrow confines of behaviors similar to our own, which would risk excluding a vast spectrum of cultural experiences. After all, other animals can see sights, hear sounds, and experience sensations we cannot. So while we can more easily notice practices that bear the hallmarks of our own first, such as tool usage and mourning lost companions, it would be a mistake to stop the cultural search there. As Beston once wrote of non-human animals, we patronize them for their incompleteness, for their tragic fate of having taken form so far below ourselves, and therein we err, and greatly err. In the course of scientific discovery, we may find that other species engage in radically new cultural traditions and practices that bear little resemblance to ours, but nonetheless have intrinsic, irreplaceable value for the communities involved. That value is what matters. Humanity is not the standard by which the rest of the animal kingdom should be judged. Rather, human institutions should be judged by the degree to which they recognize the role our fellow animals play in creating the culture-rich world we seek to preserve.
Ryan Huling leaves the listener with a startling image, a herd of bighorn sheep standing still because they've lost the history of their ancestors. It's an observation that biology isn't just a set of instructions coded in a double helix, but a library of social habits that can be lost if the lineage is broken. When Huling argues for intangible cultural heritage, it moves animals out of the bucket of nature and into the bucket of history. This makes the next piece from Smithsonian Magazine feel like a necessary pivot from the behavioral to the structural. If Huling suggests animals have a culture we've ignored, this writer shows how we've misread the very bones of their physical development. The discovery of a mislabeled baby lamprey by a veteran named Richard Rock does more than add a new species to the record. It suggests that the leap from water to land didn't require a radical midlife physical transformation like a tadpole turning into a frog. Read alongside Huling, the Smithsonian piece suggests that assumptions about evolutionary leaps might be as flawed as assumptions about animal instinct. If tetrapods were born ready for the land 390 million years ago, the progression of species looks less like a series of sudden breaks and more like a long, steady continuity.
A Vietnam veteran collected fossils for 66 years. One, mislabeled baby lamprey, made paleontologists reconsider how vertebrates moved from water to land. The fossil turned out to be a hatchling of a crocodile-like creature, and it suggests, according to a new study, that early animals did not use metamorphosis to evolve to dwell on land. Richard Rock, a Vietnam War veteran, a master gardener, and an avid fossil collector, has been picking up rocks for 66 years. His favorite site is Maison Creek, a prolific fossil bed located about 70 miles southwest of Chicago. It's renowned not only for its fossils, but also for the dedicated community of amateur scientists who brave the heat, poison ivy, and lime-bearing ticks to collect and catalog artifacts from one of the world's great paleontological reservoirs. In 2023, fellow fossil enthusiast Andrew Young asked Rock if he could photograph his collections. Rock had display cases throughout the house and an overloaded storage area in the garage, Young recalls. I went into his study, looked at the glass shelves, began to take specimens down, and I saw one that had a small laminated label that said baby lamprey. And I thought to myself, this is not a lamprey. The fossil, it turned out, was something far more important. In a study published today in Science, Field Museum researchers Arjun Maan and Jason Pardo described the specimen as a hatchling tetrapod, a member of the four-limbed lineage that gave rise to all living amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. Paired with a similar fossil already in the museum's archives and analyses of dozens of fossilized relatives, the hatchling upends the widely held idea that metamorphosis was essential for helping bring the Earth's first land-dwelling vertebrates out of the water. Did you know? The earliest tetrapods. Vertebrate tetrapods first transitioned to living on land around 390 million years ago. Some invertebrates, like the ancestors of millipedes, were already living on land at the time. Today, even legless reptiles such as snakes are considered tetrapods because they descend from the four-limbed tetrapod common ancestor. You probably saw pictures of tetrapods in high school biology. They were ancient and vaguely lizard-like creatures, initiating vertebrates' initial transition from water to land. For decades, scientists widely assumed that tetrapods managed this shift through metamorphosis, beginning as waterborne tadpoles, much like modern frogs, then reorganizing their entire body plan to become partially land-dwelling adults. This hypothesis emerged in part because the modern animals that look the most like early tetrapods are salamanders that experience metamorphosis. But Florian Witzmann, the curator of the fossil fish and amphibian collection at Berlin's Natural History Museum, who was not involved in the new research, argues that the analogy was always flawed. It makes sense, he says, that metamorphosis might have evolved later. Before Rock's fossil turned up, Mann and Pardo had spent several years analyzing another specimen from the Field Museum collections. While working late in the lab, Mann noticed that the mysterious fossil had a tiny, budding limb. To figure out what creature they were looking at, the researchers, as Mann puts it, went through a list of candidate animals from the time based on the morphology, slowly eliminated those based on anatomical features, which excluded those groups, until we landed on our diagnosis. Ultimately, imagery with a scanning electron microscope allowed the scientists to identify the animal as an embelomere, a crocodile-like predator that dominated ecosystems between 280 million and 350 million years ago. Rock's fossil appeared to be the same species. His specimen shows more of the outside of the body at a younger state, Mann says, so it augmented the story significantly. Importantly, these two hatchlings did not show signs of being in a tadpole-like life phase. The embelomere preserved by Rock's fossil has miniature legs, for instance, and it lacks external gills, the feathery appendages that salamander larvae use to breathe underwater before reabsorbing them at metamorphosis. These two fossils are basically miniaturized versions of the adults, Mann explains. They just progressively get bigger and bigger and bigger until you get a giant alligator-sized animal. That is the signature of direct development, the same growth strategy used by mammals, birds, reptiles, and even many amphibians today. The study suggests that early tetrapods followed this plan rather than metamorphosis, so the water-to-land transition must have initially taken a different path. According to Nadia Frobisch, an evolutionary biologist at Berlin's Natural History Museum, who was not involved in the research, some tetrapod experts had been expecting a hatchling fossil with the characteristics of direct development to appear. We kind of all have been waiting for it, she says. We never had direct evidence, and now Arjun Maan and Jason Pardo found the direct evidence. Still, these two fossils alone did not rule out metamorphosis across tetrapods. Perhaps the embelomers were a branch that just happened to evolve toward direct development. But Mon and Pardo examined thousands of juvenile fossils from other early tetrapod relatives, and they found no evidence in any of them of metamorphosis. It's not one species, Pardo says. We can go to every stem group tetrapod, every animal that's part of this fin-to-limb transition. Every animal that we find in the Mason Creek assemblage that falls into that category lacks anything that would point to metamorphosis. Frobisher thinks that there is little to debate about Mon and Pardo's conclusion. I cannot think of anybody who would say this does not fit into the evolutionary picture at all, she says. Witzman agrees. The fossils are very beautiful, he says. You have so many soft parts preserved. Cartilage, bone, skin. I would make the same interpretation. This pristine preservation is a rare feature of the fossils found in Mason Creek. In most other locations, finding specimens of hatchling animals is difficult or impossible. Babies are small, and their skeletons are partly made of cartilage, which degrades rapidly after death. It takes a specific set of conditions to preserve the minuscule packages of soft tissue left behind by juveniles. Fortunately, Mason Creek was up to the task. Roughly 309 million years ago, the region was a vast river delta, swept by seasonal floods that dragged thick, iron-rich mud into the sediment and buried many unlucky plants and animals beneath it. In other locations, bacteria would have broken down these organisms completely. There, however, the dissolved iron in the mud surrounding the carcasses reacted with the carbon dioxide released by bacteria. This turned the mud into siderite, an iron carbonate mineral. Within days or weeks of an organism's death, it would be encased in a hard mineral nodule, sometimes before soft tissue had time to rot away.
This geochemical process left behind millions of concretions, little egg-shaped stones, as Young describes them, that collectors can smash or freeze-thaw to reveal the fossils within. Usually, collectors would have had to dig into the ground to recover these orbs, but in the mid-20th century, the coal mining industry began to strip mine Mason Creek, which made the concretions readily accessible in the exposed shale. Over the past 8 decades, Mason Creek has garnered attention from collectors and citizen scientists. You have a coal mining site near a major population during a time period when people socialized in rock swaps and had a penchant for collecting stuff, says Yum, who serves as a bridge between the Mason Creek citizen scientist community and professional researchers at the Field Museum. Today, some of these enthusiasts visit Mason Creek multiple times each week to collect more concretions. These are such smart and educated people, Pardo says. They know what they're looking at better than I do sometimes. Since 1960, Rock has been a preeminent member of this community of citizen scientists. Inspired by fossil ferns at a science fair, he went to Mason Creek for the first time in middle school with his dad. He showed me what a good concretion was and showed me that you can smash it with a hammer, Rock says. So I started collecting. A few years later, his dad decided to count how many fossils Rock had brought home. I had to go someplace, Rock recalls. I came back 4 or 5 hours later, and my dad was sitting at my desk. And I said, "Well, did you get done?" And he said, "No, I quit at 50,000. And he said he had created a monster. Rock doesn't remember picking up the baby tetrapod, but once he'd heard Mann and Pardo's thoughts on the specimen, he knew he needed to donate it to the museum. I realized very quickly that it was an extremely important fossil, Rock says. In the museum's collections, rather than his own, he adds, the object could, quote, help us learn something about the past that we don't know. If metamorphosis did not form the evolutionary bridge from water to land, then some other set of traits must have done the job. For now, no one knows the complete story. Sometimes you have to destroy in order to create, Mann says. We've just torn down a long-standing hypothesis. Now we have to start from scratch. As for Rock, he's pleased that his 66 years of collecting could contribute something to the enterprise. The fossil he found is the size of a dime, he recalls. My wife said, "How could you ever even see to pick it up?" And as I told her, I pick everything up. Doesn't matter what it is, because you don't know what it is until you get some time to look.
The songs of sperm whales, or the hunting techniques passed down through pods, are more than instincts. They are lived experiences, a form of heritage that lives outside of DNA. When a chance find upends what was known about the first breath taken on land, it suggests the record of life is still being revised. What lingers is the sense that the line between human culture and wild biology is thinner than it once seemed. If the past is a shared inheritance of bone and behavior, what happens to the definition of history when humans aren't its only subjects?